The Game Boy Advance Boktai trilogy of games released within the time frame of the early 2000s, and to me is the crowning jewel of what is technically possible on such a small handheld device. The series features isometric 3D, exploration, puzzles, and combat in which exploiting foes' weaknesses is pivotal. It is essentially that with elements of The Legend of Zelda and Metal Gear Solid. Never mind that Hideo Kojima worked as the game designer and was the producer for the series as a whole. In fact, I was playing these games before I even knew what MGS was. And what a shock that was for my younger self. Nonetheless, I have never experienced such well-designed systems on the Game Boy Advance that collectively produce something that not only feels so cohesive, but design-wise, something that is art. It has that draw, at least to me, of something timeless in its design and execution that demonstrates how much of a genuine masterpiece these games are. And yet, the game series didn't do all that well, at least in the Western world, which is a serious shame given its cowboy Western themes loosely tied to Norse mythology and maybe a hint of Castlevania flair. Especially in its initial title positing, in which you defeat the dark undead immortals that threaten to destroy the sun and, by extension, living life. Anyhow, in this video I'll absolutely nerd out about the Boktai series and detailing what the experience is like. I encourage you to try it if you haven't. So I had a lot of ideas of how to structure this video, and I couldn't figure out whether it should have been 1 or 3 videos, and decided on the latter. This is probably my most ambitious idea to date, so thanks in advance if you somehow clicked on this video. The series is somewhat niche given its main draw of the actual physical solar sensor on its specifically designed gamepad cartridges, as using IRL sunlight as a means of energy to navigate the systems of the game in of itself is extraordinarily creative, but also limiting in it affects the where, when, and how you can approach the game. But that's part of the allure in making the experience dependent on how you can adapt to scenarios that you can absolutely manage if you utilize the tools the game provides. And it teaches you how to pace yourself. Rather than being a gimmick, however, the overall experience designed around using light as a concept is more than that, as its level of gameplay and utilization of it is incredibly interactive beyond the scopes of constraint of the game itself, which provides a one-of-a-kind experience. I would know, as I have extensively played through them in my childhood. Of course, to play them now, I think that the solar sensor mods will be required, as it would take an unreasonable amount of time to beat and record footage if I were to play the series in the way that was actually intended. While there are videos that go over the series, I ain't no tourist, as I grew up playing these games extensively and love them to bits, and have a burning desire to share my thoughts on what is one of the greatest gaming series for me. Like many people, my first exposure to the series was with Mega Man Battle Network 4, which actually featured a crossover with Django with a whole amusement park and a side quest that involved Shademan.exe. Let's move back in time to the early 2000s, which was still the pre-internet ubiquity era. Word of mouth was essential for success and building your IP, so seeing this crossover was an invitation from Capcom to try playing Konami games. This was something never really done back in the day, I'd say, and especially for GBA games, and to me demonstrates one of the best usages of a crossover I've seen, and continues in this series and slightly beyond it with Mega Man Star Force and Lunar Nights, the spiritual successors respectively to the Battle Network and Boktai series on the Nintendo DS. The assumption how this came to be is that Kojima's son was a huge fan of the Battle Network games and wanted Mega Man in Boktai. I don't know if this is true, but if it is, it really just shows that pure earnest desire of seeing something you like realized in another franchise, and to me it's the greatest example of a collaboration done right. There are so many little features and design elements that I can't believe that this is a GBA game. If someone were to metaphorically strap you down to a seat, threaten you to watch gameplay or risk severing your mortal coil, and then ask you to determine what system this was on, I'd think if you never played the games, you'd have a hard time thinking that this was on the Game Boy Advance. You got features associated with the internal clock, which few games such as the Pokemon series uses the game pack's battery-associated timer for events, egg hatching, and so on, but here it controls things such as a real-time night and day cycle that alters enemy spawns and environmental behaviors. For the second and third games, the internal timer also affects the rate in which items spoil in your inventory, as most items are fruits, and the rate is increased or decreased by the relative energy hitting your solar sensor. The solar gauge also passively affects the storage of energy that you may use at stations, while also acting as a banking system that converts the collected energy into the game's currency. So, in the later 2 games, and there is an interest rate accrued on real day cycles. Using solar power as a basis of decision making for combat associated energy costs or as money for upgrades and items is seriously great design. Using a mixture of either sunlight intensity and or extensive duration will also incur overheating, which will damage you and make the sunlight unusable for a while. The level of sun also affects enemy behaviors and stage effects. Combine that with action RPG elements with things such as upgrading weapons using the Solar Smith minigames, level ups and stats, and so much more. It's like, how is this game doing all this? But in terms of raw gameplay, I want to note something specifically, even how combat is made interesting, as while it is rather ancient at least for today's standards, it still nonetheless is fun and engaging. You see, our protagonist, Django, operates based on 8 directions for movements, and that's also applied to how you ready weapons. So unlike most games, you have the armor stance that can shift based on those directions before attacking. Yet, the game also features a negative edge input in the action of attacking itself. You must release the attack button instead of simply pressing it. What this means in gameplay is that it's entirely possible to flub attack if you receive damage, as you can get hit in between the 3 stages of arming, attacking, and recovery lag. Or if you press the button too quickly, either starting or after another attack, then you won't be able to, as it appears that there's little or no input buffering. This also applies to attacking too frequently, as damage update text makes it so optimizing your energy usage and attacks is also important. Add that in with mechanics such as stealth, leveling up your elemental lens in the first game, improving damage and projectile sizes with a 4-part gun customization, alongside the uniqueness of the frames or the gun portion itself. The later games have character stats, armor, and various weapon types that redefine the experience and arguably improved it into more of a ARPG style experience. So it is imperative for you to understand positioning, distance, and enemy behavior that naturally goes beyond most of the ideas people have about GBA games, and has a lot of nuance. For instance, the strength stat also affects the rate in which you can drag the coffin necessary to move the bosses. There are creative solutions for bosses, or you may use tricks such as alluring specific enemies towards light sources to defeat them. Alright, if anything of how this game makes an insane effort in realizing its systems, I want you to understand the game's idea of level design. When you enter a main dungeon, you have to progress through whatever the game throws at you, and then obviously the boss fights themselves. But every boss fight is actually 2, as you must drag their sorry states backwards with your coffin. As each dungeon is actually 2, as it was designed in mind to be fun and engaging as both a front to back and back to front experience. Level design is accommodated so as you are traveling in, you are also naturally thinking of how to work it out backwards, as pathing, enemy placements, and level design gimmicks make it a step above in terms of gameplay. The finality involves the pile driver sequence at the very start, in which the player provides a metaphorical rapid onset of sunlight-induced cancer onto the big bad, and is one of my favorite demonstrations of presentation possible on the Game Boy Advance system. Music implemented as stages for the process is used to set up the cool science fiction and technological associations that Kojima always uses in his titles, and it works wonders here. I cannot tell you how many GBA titles use such effects to this specific degree just for short yet impactful segments of the game that only last less than 5 minutes. Every boss battle is a great send-off that really tells you how much love and dedication was poured to make this kind of experience possible. There really is nothing like it, never mind just in the GBA game catalog. Although the games share a similar approach and overall structure, each game does its own thing with how it provides meaningful and unique gameplay that you expect from a trilogy and making each experience worthwhile. I like all 3 games almost equally for the different things that they attempt to do. It was like the developers asked themselves, how do we one-up ourselves for each iterative experience? The first game has many mini-dungeons to present fun gimmicks alongside the main ones. The second game features a hub city and expands the scope of main stages while having fewer yet larger optional dungeons. While the third game removes overworld areas and mini-dungeons altogether with additional objectives in the main areas, post-boss clear. It also has a motorcycle minigame. It's all a fine balance of space required to determine what makes the cut, given that the Game Boy Advance cartridges only have up to 32 megabytes of space maximum, probably less than that given that they had to fit a solar sensor and battery timer component. Somehow, in that limited space, they also decided to put presentation aspects too that gives it a sense of being a well-rounded experience rather than the simplistic nature that most GBA titles have of maybe having 1 or 2 good outstanding things going for it. If I were to describe the overall thematics of each game, it would be mystery in resolving the particulars of a decrepit dying world in the first game. The second one focuses on reconnecting to one's past roots to discover wider truths, while the third game is all about preserving the bonds that you established previously. Out of all the parts and bits that make up the Boktai series, one thing that stands out to me is that it's a game with a moral message. The sun will rise tomorrow, as the saying in the games go. While it is a seemingly no-brainer, it speaks to the resilience to keep trying, not only because tomorrow is another day to do so, but today's efforts shapes tomorrow's circumstances. Slow yet sure effort is the manifestation of human will that drives home the message that you don't give up when the going gets tough, as it speaks to progress and change. Perhaps this simply speaks to the generic shonen tropes of Japanese entertainment adjacent manga and anime about perseverance, but this really is solidified as its own thing, I'd say, for the best ending for the third game that reminds me of Kojima's other works. In any case, I decided, well, it's almost been a decade or more since I played the games, so why not return to play them after 20 years after this third game's release, and present what it's actually like to interact with said titles in the trilogy to see if they still hold up today. Spoilers, yes of course they do, and major spoilers overall, as I'll go over them in reverse order starting with the third game so you can appreciate the sense of progression the developers have added over time. So the first is the last, and what strikes me immediately, other than Django's updated character model, is the level design and use of color in the game. You see, I would say that the first two games use more faded and dark colors to portray its end-of-the-world vibe, and while I wouldn't say that it's dull, it definitely felt intentionally muted and in a way associated more so with tile sets that may or may not be visually cohesive, though Boktai 2 improves massively in that regard. I'd say the way that art is presented here breaks from the initial designs and conventions with far more expressive use of color and consistent level design. At the start of the game, you can see the combination of purple and green that was not common in the series. This is further noticeable as the third game reduces the overall amount of puzzles that the series is known for, so a shift of style likely meant a restructuring of how the developers visually altered level design for a more straightforward experience. Overall, I like the style as it feels far more expressive and less limiting. While the former works well, I think 3 games worth of that style would not be great. I remember playing it back in the day and feeling that something was off about it, as it didn't share as many similarities as with Boktai 1 and 2, and such decisions I think was really meant for it to be a send-off for the series. What is here in terms of level design is purposely crafted to bend prior expectations. Constraint meets design. If you look at the levels here, you have an underground prison, i.e. a tomb, an empty out town, a giant tree, a geothermal snow forest, a pirate island, and the space castle from the first game. Now if you think about it, each one of these newer levels are designed in mind in a way that takes the constraint of how these function. The prison is expectedly corridors as it doubles as a tutorial area, the town features mainly straightforward alleys and bits of buildings, a giant tree has layers going upwards, a forest is really wide, and the pirate ships feature vertical levels like an actual ship. Form kinda follows function, which you would expect, but wasn't necessarily the case from the previous 2 games. Rather, the first 2 levels feature a mixture of, while I wouldn't say stitched together zones, especially the first game, they were primarily designed for puzzle function first, rather than art design or visual presentation. As a result, level design and the flow of going through levels feels far more cohesive and smoother compared to the earlier titles. Boktai 3 is somewhat more balanced between puzzles and level design, and is mainly straightforward until the end in my opinion, as I hardly got stuck or confused of where to go. The visual structure and what is there made it easy to navigate. Furthermore, for the main dungeons in previous titles, the developers decided that each area was assigned an elemental aspect that mainly defined the sort of upgrades and boss design cues. That isn't exactly the case anymore in Boktai 3, as bosses aren't related elementally to their zone of dominion, which is a nice departure. The second major standout is that the game features both ranged and melee options, as the first game was exclusively about using the Gun del Sol, the renowned weapon of the Solar Boy, while the second was all about melee options generally. Also, on top of all the other insane amount of things in this game, is that Boktai 2 and 3 featured the quick swap menu that Metal Gear Solid has, which frankly I have no idea how they got this to work with everything else in the game. Overall, one of the things I remembered back then in 3 was that the Gun del Sol was really weak, but that's also because stats wise this game only featured 3 attributes: Vitality, Energy, and Strength. Whenever you level up, you gain 2 points, which I primarily won for Vitality and Strength. After replaying it, I still think the gun option is pretty weak, as I think the intended gameplay style is to mix it up. Use your ranged options and pepper them from afar, and then finish them off with a stronger melee option. Unlike Boktai 2, you cannot overwhelm enemies as quickly as tactical and or espionage action is encouraged here, as they don't also have the agility stat here that improves movement and attack speed. It works well, and I'm actually a fan here the most out of the series, as it makes the decision making process and proper use of your tools far more prominent and, most importantly, natural. The other option with melee is with swords, as it got reduced from various weapon types from Boktai 2 and loses 2's elemental magic imbuing. The range is limited as they should be, but interestingly, the developers differentiated how many and what kind of swings the weapons have: horizontal, vertical, and piercing, with different speeds based on what specific weapon you're using, and not just the type. There are curved swords, katanas, long swords, and great swords, and each and every weapon in each category has a coded swing combination that makes each weapon a bit more personal than a simple generic attack animation string set that you see in Boktai 2. Weapons have durability on their bonuses just like 2 as well, but I think I've only heard it drop like once. The Solar Smith in this game can improve durability, power stages via Roman numerals 2 and 3, and add effects called SP effects that add elements or status effects by smithing together weapons with accessories. Overall for combat, you want to fish for back attacks as they hit more on exploitable enemies, as well as using elemental matchups. But overall, it feels like you cannot roll over most enemies immediately like you can in the earlier Boktais. There is that grit and tension as you whittle enemies down, and now also shows enemy levels to give you more of an idea of the difference in power. That's a new feature too in 3, albeit probably only visually. So being a continuation of the first 2 games, perhaps it isn't the best to explain the end events, but nonetheless I don't think knowing the plot itself will ruin the enjoyment of the game, as it's rather story light and a bit more heavy in lore. The overall premise is that Django, who is a titled Solar Boy and Vampire Hunter, travels on with Otenko, the sidekick and messenger of the sun, to defeat the undead immortals that primarily rule the world. The will of the galaxy is an important concept of destiny in the series, that dark will overcome light in replacing life with the everlasting. As mankind's ambitions will spread across the universe and expedite its destruction, the idea is that the undead will take control of the world as their numbers do not grow. The will is metaphysical as the landscape itself and phenomena falls decay. Any attempt to divert from it will naturally return to its desolate state unless its source, the immortals, are dealt with. The opposition is Django, as the protagonist's special hereditary characteristics of being a solar child with a special scarf that is naturally a deterrent to mortals makes him their archenemies. The various NPCs, whose roles and introductions are from the second game, are all accounted for as they return here in San Miguel, Django's hometown, and is one of the last bastions of humanity. To restore, or rather to maintain light, you go around various places to ensure that dark is managed, as you cannot truly have one without the other. So in the first game, Django saves his older twin brother Sabata, as evil being evil tricks Sabata into thinking that Hel, the matriarchal ruler of the immortals of the first game, was his mother. Django and Sabata, being blood brothers, are actually children to Ringo, the solar bloodline vampire hunter, and the immortal Mani, who is the lunar maiden descendant who is actually Hel's sister. Anyhow, Hel teaches Sabata how to use the corrupting dark energy that eats away at himself as a cruel experiment, as this being a metaphorical opposition to light and the sun is also a major theme across the series. With all that out of the way, let's begin in earnest. For this game, there's an attempt to use Sabata's hereditary properties, as he inherits more of the lunar child bloodline compared to Django's mainly solar child inheritance from his father. The lunar lineage's properties are associated with sealing a major evil that was somehow never really relevant until now. The main villain with this purpose is Ratatos, or Ratatoskr in Old Norse, who is the leader of the Demon Clan. His clan was nearly wiped out by the Lunar Children, and they've been largely inactive due to the clashing immortal groups that made up the other 2 camps, who strive overall for leadership. The first is the Death Clan associated with the enemies of Boktai 1, and the second is the Shadow Clan that Django clashes with in Boktai 2. Ratatos' design is really cool, as the most squirrel-like element of him is that he wears a fur coat and has reddish hair, as perhaps associated with a red squirrel, as otherwise he doesn't have anything to do with being one. But one thing to note is that he's the type of boss that is the brains of the group. Although he can fight, nothing about him particularly stands out to demonstrate his strengths, as he isn't the true final boss. It is a good subtlety of why, as it's later shown that he struggles to defeat even a small child later on. Specifically, as he is coined the puppeteer, his immortal powers allow him to control others, so his plan to control Sabata and offer him up as a sacrifice of Vanagond, or another name for Fenrir. Vanagard's freedom spells Ragnarok in Norse mythology, which is the Doomsday event. So yeah, by extension of controlling Sabata, he controls the beast of destruction, therefore the world, which is foretold by the time-traveling Trinity. Trinity is a boy from the future who escapes from the destined reality in which Ratatos fulfills his ambitions of ruling the world, and implies that the trajectory of the world is predetermined. The immortals are victorious and humans are the mistrustful, backstabbing minority that live underground, as the topside is inhospitable to life and overall is a crumbling world without a future. The rumor has it that the legendary warrior who was meant to defeat the immortals was never found, as a betrayal has removed him from the equation. By sheer circumstance, luck, or predestination, Trinity breaks you out of jail by somehow time warping, and in Mario style, you are freed after an implied to be controlled Sabata defeats you and puts you more than 6 feet under. Congrats, you have amnesia as well. And such starts the quest to defeat the mortals and save the day again for hopefully the last time. This time, however, with more story and dialogue, as Trinity acts as an annoying redeemable brat archetype in your journey. But yeah, like all the areas with their previous associations, each of the 4 areas is attributed by an immortal, as their characteristics are relevant gameplay-wise to their area of dominion. Each area also provides you with an elemental lens, as it's video game tradition to provide something equally important in old school game design. The first real area of the game is the Lifeless Town. And like all the rest of the games, it features a tutorial scenario in which the Count of Ground-Soaking Blood is great for. He returns from the very first game as he considers himself a rival to Django and Sabata in the struggle between light and dark. He is so persistent that he repeatedly comes back for the thrill of the battle, as immortals can eventually come back even from getting purified. They cannot truly die unless there is no dark left. As for the level layout of this place, it is one of the best presentations I've seen for a tutorial area that teaches you so many aspects of the game so quickly. If you wanted to play the third game to start the series for some reason, it isn't a bad place to start. The art is incredible and easily is my most favorite area out of all the locales in the game. Django picks up the fire lens here, as gameplay wise, the developer usually gives you the fire element as one of the first ones. What the area does well is the clear division between indoors and outdoors, which allows you to be more lenient with resources, as it teaches you that you shouldn't waste all your resources fighting generic mobs indoors, and noting the specific pathways that may be used for later. That double weight switch in particular is one of the best examples of this back-front padding. The vampire mode from the second game returns during a fight with an armored suit, but this time under the trance gauge bar as a temporary power-up rather than a state to swap in and out of. I didn't actually use transformations as the game is easy enough already, but if you want to get out of my face option, it is available. Anyhow, like all the first major bosses in the series, the Count is meant to be easy, and he is representative of a prime and proper vampire type. There isn't much to note about the fight itself, as it isn't anything special mirroring his original fight, and teaches the basics of combat essentials. The run back to the purification pile driver spot is well balanced, I'd say, for any first timers, and it just feels satisfying rolling through the game, which is something I want to note overall about the experience. Being the dirt game, it isn't trying to surprise you at this point, given that you've probably done this for 2 games already and it's kinda lax overall. One thing I want to point out is that the coffin encased immortal will attempt to knock you away and will attempt to move itself back to its original arena. But if you have power nuts or know the shortest path from room to room, you likely won't have it happen. You can also slap the coffin silly to make them behave. But yeah, the purification boss fight is pretty easy as well, his HP drops pretty quickly even at half solar sensor levels. Moving on, the ancient tree level is all about layers that go up and up. The ancient tree is actually one of the solar trees, which again being Norse mythology is akin to something like Jagersil as the epitome of life, as trees usually are. Here, they deter and undo the rank decay and miasma of the undead as it allows living life to flourish instead. The use of color here is used to denote the differences in verticality, and the area itself is one of the first examples in this game of how solar energy affects environments, as higher solar energy levels makes it more windy for outdoors branch sections or reveals hidden pathways that are normally not accessible without sunlight. Unsurprisingly, you get the Earth lens here for the Gun del Sol. One of the problems the game has is asset reuse. The same enemies since the first game will make their appearance here as there are hardly any new minor enemies, minus the stationary ones. This is rather minor in my opinion as they change their behaviors and how you interact with them game to game. Regardless, the game immediately cues you to ideas about its gameplay niches here, and the boss here is pretty cool. So generally, most boss fights in the Boktai series aren't just hit the dude, but you gotta do something else to hit them, Legend of Zelda style. Hresvolgar, who is an insatiable glutton that saps living energy, which implies its locational significance, can Izuna drop you, and I wish they really added a spinning animation to really sell it. After purifying this immortal, the Count shows up again as he fooled you previously by leaving a bit of himself as a bat with Trinity. With the energy sapped by Hresvolgar, he's too strong, but the Solar Tree calls out to you and provides you with a new transformation called Soul Trance. The Count is defeated for like the 4th time now. The next area is the White Forest, and its volcanic contrast with snow leans into the idea of hot and cold elements. Right, so it's a forest without a single tree. Am I missing some context here? But yeah, probably lava afterwards that alters the environment. So more story beats are revealed here as Carmilla, the Crying Witch, is reintroduced after meeting her in the first game, as her soul resides in Sabata after the events of Boktai 1. Her appearance therefore shouldn't be normally possible, which means something has gone wrong, and so you investigate deeper into the Winter Wonderland to discover why. Though the more wild art style in the snow area generally works, the asset reuse is more noticeable as there are less interesting variations you can do with what is generally a white plain, especially with GBA limitations. The map feels more open as it should given that it's supposed to be a forest, and the various paths you can take noted by the cardinal arrow sections is definitely a standout. It isn't common to have so many paths at once in the later games, but it isn't exactly new in the series. The biggest gimmick here is the grenade launcher Gundam Soul Frame, as you can use it to open up areas with weak structural integrity, much the same as the dynamite magic in Boktai 2. Though it has more use cases of breaking walls here, I think that the limitations of the GBA still make it a rather underused mechanic. I don't think I've used it for such purposes more than a handful of times. Ice area means ice lens clearly. I'd say it probably is the least interesting area in the game, but I still love it as I love snow areas in video games overall, especially pixel art depictions of water, crystalline structures, and blue colors overall. I love this boss fight with Sabata, by the way. The arena is something that always stuck out to me. Although it isn't likely related, the room itself is actually almost the same one as the boss fight against Hades in the Hades. But fighting against a backdrop of a snowy forest with a lake in the background against someone who wields darkness and metaphorical death, and also shares the same capabilities as you given your hereditary similarities. Oddly specific, and I'd say this is something like Convergent Evolution in video games. That, or someone is a big fan of Boktai at Supergiant Games. I don't know. This is probably the only time you'd hear someone comparing a niche GBA game to something so modern. Anyhow, he fights just like you, which is something I didn't actually appreciate when I was a kid, as it seemed more annoying as I just wanted a straightforward fight that I could swing my sword at him. This fight added additional depth and nuance to the fight that didn't exist back then, which, spoilers, you fight him in the first game. But here, the gameplay is elevated a bit more as he doesn't feel like something just thrown in. It seems like some slight asset reuse is in play here too, as one of the attacks is like a certain boss in Boktai 2. When you beat him, Sabata regains some control of himself and divulges this scenario to Django as this is the first time he gains some information of what's finally going on. He then asks you to purify him as the most final extreme measure, as that would remove the dark matter that Rattatas is using to control him. If anything cuts deep, it's the idea that Sabata is someone who is knowledgeable of such matters and has the wrong idea of what's happening, as the whole process is still steadily in the hands of the villain. By purifying him, it is presumed that he may die, but that's not actually the case. Rather, this fulfills the conditions necessary as Rattatas comes out from the shadows to capture Sabata in his most exploitable state. So imagine that, trying your hardest, struggling, and losing all the while that's according to someone else's plan. I'll speak more about it later, but if it's anything that gives that sense of fate and the inability to change, this really cements the idea of hopelessness. This is especially the case for someone whose voice or perspective has been intentionally removed from the story to begin with. It's all really futile in a way. The next area is the Pirate Bay area, which happens to have a magical canyon to transport you to outer space. It's pretty awesome as it is completely and thematically divergent from the rest of the series, and probably is my second most favorite area of the game overall, as the ship aspect of it was pretty well done with its layers. The layout itself is basically 2.25 explorable ships with a bit of a landmass in between them that loosely serves as a connection point, one after the other. I forgot to mention it, but somehow, probably being the first foray back into playing the series, but a puzzle here kinda stumped me for a bit, like in the tree level, so it's good to see that some things don't change after all this time. Also, unlike the rest of the Boktai games, this isn't the only one to introduce commonly breakable bits on the map. They are largely cosmetic, but some of them drop items rarely. This placement of skull and bones here feels a bit oversaturated overall, as I wish they had more of this kind of stuff, but limitations on all that. But in terms of assets, it appears that the ship level overall has many unique things in it that helps distinguish the map more compared to, say, the snow forest. You get the cloud lens in this area, as this is the last one to collect. The association here is a bit of a stretch as is related to wind, but the decay and broken down nature of the ships is there, I guess, to demonstrate the sweeping effects of wind over time. I have to say that this area and especially the boss fight seems to push the GBA to the limits. So unlike many games on the GBA, this game series actually introduced me to the concept of frame rate and other ideas related to the technical aspects of gaming before I even knew what they were. Somehow, the developers were able to design features that tank game logic and frame rate without crashing, and wow, I don't think I've seen anyone talk about this kind of stuff for GBA games. So yeah, extraordinarily ambitious in that regard too, as game logic slows to a crawl with the Needhogger fight whenever there are too many effects on the screen. This applies to all three Boktai games in a seemingly iterative increase, but it's the most prevalent here as it exists in place outside of boss fights as well. But yes, as for the Needhogger fight itself, it's an alright fight, but it felt really more like a tech demo. The presentation aspect of using canyons on the last functioning ship for a large-scale battle against a mecha sounds great on paper. Its body has various entries on its backside to denote what sort of actions are situated against you is cool, but with how many things are going on, it actually isn't all that great with its projectiles blocking the canyons most of the time, so you never really get to hit them with the canyons once the fight picks up in intensity. But luckily, the fight itself doesn't actually require you to use the canyons, as the gun del Sol is more than enough. The boss fight actually has two parts as well prior to purification, which is a rarity given that only one other boss appears to do this. After the ship battle, you then fight the actual boss, who is actually some nerd in the cockpit. The fight is rather basic as it demonstrates that he isn't much without his goofy machine. Oh, and I went full solar sensor on him just cause. Finally, a return back to the Dark Castle, which has major significance from the first game as its final area. Thematically, Rathatos is attempting to succeed those before him as the leader of the Immortals, so while it is asset reuse, it doesn't bother me at all. A return to the past to finish things off once and for all, hopefully. But just like the first game, it features a redux of the areas you've encountered, and they are associated with the 4 elements. The first area, B15, and the middle lift, B9, will have puzzle sections in which you must complete 4 puzzles to fill in the walkway to unlock the next level to ascend. And there will be simple boss fights sandwiched between with B12 and B6 between those two to raise those levels. Most of the new puzzles generally do things that you have not seen so far in the game, but some of them are actually really neat. Take the second cloud element puzzle on B9, which features riddles from the 3 skeleton brothers in which you must measure the weight of creatures relative to the various crates. Or the second ice element one, which you must swap between 4 elements to work out the solution. After ascending to floor 3, Django starts the final climb to the top of the tower, much the same as the original. There are 3 puzzles at the start of every other floor which involves arithmetic, which may be a reference to the original, as no doubt asking for something so simple for an endgame area would be really strange. Each floor between those puzzle ones involves hazards and slight enemy variations, with the last one in this area which requires sunlight to create walkways, which again is the reason why I think the whole thing is a homage to the original. Near the top is the area in which you had the confrontation with Sabata in the first game, and the game attempts to replicate that here, except that Trinity heroically sacrifices himself in revealing that this Sabata is a fake, given that Trinity is familiar with Rathatos' methods. Fight the very last living armor suit that swaps elements midway in order to reach that oh so familiar stairway to the throne room. He explains his motives as usually bad guys do and notes that the process is too far in to stop him. The 2 components of Sabata with his lunar blood and the advent of a lunar eclipse. Being late to the scene, Django was too late to save Sabata as he was transferred to the moon already, and your earlier purification of him was actually useful for Rathatos to control the already weakened Sabata, as dark matter isn't how his powers work. Since you two don't see eye to eye with a potential Lord of Destruction, here comes a battle. This guy's a bit tricky as he moves around a lot and loves filling the screen with projectiles and copies of yourself. Being a trickster, he can also go invisible for you to club him over the head, as he hides and lets the puppet copies of Django deal with you. Around the halfway point, he now utilizes the previously mentioned black holes, which serve as a teleportation, which you can also take for yourself, and it spews out these breakables to harm you. Neat asset reuse. You then purify Rathatos right here and now, and just like with the final boss in Boktai 1. It would be crazy to have to drag him out given the story-related circumstances of the time-sensitive nature of the world ending, but I'd be down for it. Anyhow, perhaps it doesn't really matter, but I'm curious why the solar sensor didn't activate prior to the fight itself, but now does given that the moon is shading over the sun. Otenko is definitely holding back on us or something. In any case, this dude is pitiful for what is the final immortal purification, as he is indeed not that special in terms of physical capability. Since you now deleted the only guy possible who can control Vanguard, there is nothing you can do to stop this doomsday beast, who is an internal or a being of true immortality. Not the first time that Django has dealt with one, as with Boktai 2, so I'm possibly sure that it's not much of a problem. Anyhow, seeing how foolish you are, Rathatos provides you the means to teleport to the moon so you can be ironically eliminated by the person you are trying to save. Otenko reveals that this paradise was once the city of the lunar children, and hopefully as Rathatos' magic is lifted, then Sabata should be of his own wits now. Yeah, nah. He is fully integrated with Vanagon, and you get these snippets of his last bits of consciousness as he explains his perspectives of the events of the game, as he was robbed of the choice to do so the entire game. So being a send-off, he highlights the overall scenario of the series, and how deep down inside, he feels powerless regardless of all that has occurred so far. It is ironic given his tenacity to forge his own path. Being Hell's experiment that has cut his remaining lifespan, he also inadvertently causes the death of his mother, relying upon the extraordinary powers of others just to fail, and finally comes the term of finding purpose in life with your help in Boktai 2. And here comes a gut punch instead with Boktai 3's scenario. He feels like abject failure as he tries his hardest to overcome the struggles that he felt responsible for by attempting to forge the future instead with his own hands. Being purified by you, he is void of the dark energy that he uses to fight. And look at him now, still just a tool in someone else's scheme. This is some seriously existential crisis stuff and likely not to be absorbed or appreciated by the kids who this was likely marketed for. The Beast of Destruction's tendencies awaken as his last bits of consciousness fade, and the area becomes a dungeon. Unfortunately, I think this area suffers from technical limitations as there isn't much to see. The final enemies are these darker shades of skeletons that are the final grind, if you wish, before fighting the final boss. I actually got lost again like the first time playing, as there's a spot that you're supposed to press on the wall to pass, which is another issue I had with one of the puzzles in the Dark Castle. I don't know, it's something about putting something on the top left corner of the screen that makes me go, huh? Sabata is here as well if you want to see text on his destructive urges. As you head down the various flights of stairs and avoid these spiritual hazards, Carmilla is here again to note his condition, and it all seems hopeless. The final framing before the fight is pretty cool, as you can see a majority of dark energy matter bits and just the teeniest bits of lunar energy. Dark is consuming Sabata. And so it is where the game begins is also where it ends, with the same battle arena where Sabata encounters Venargand. Through Sabata, it is revealed that the Beast of Destruction wishes to destroy everything in order for the world to experience a rebirth of sorts. Anyhow, it's time to get the best ending possible. Though I mentioned the trance states earlier, and the player's usage of it is actually associated with the ending you get. What I have a problem with is that the game says that the dark power in itself is not inherently good or evil, and yet one of the requirements to get the best ending of the game is to make sure that you use the soul one more compared to the vampire one. So it's like, what? There's some clear favoritism going on, but additionally, Boktai 3 features dialogue that influences the ending, and more dialogue options overall for Django. While this isn't new, it offers more personality and overall characterization to Django, who is primarily a silent character. So the other requirement to get the best ending is to not hit Sabata himself in this fight, who sits in a cockpit style position underneath the beast's chest. In terms of mechanics, this is probably the best boss battle. Defeat both of the hands that temporarily stuns the beast so it drops its head, which you can do more damage on it. One thing I do like about Boktai 3's bosses is that they are way more durable than the other games and feels like a great boss encounter, unlike Boktai 2's final boss, which was really easy. I like the hit the projectiles back at it thing going on, like the Dead Man's Volley with Ganondorf in the Legend of Zelda series. It's a fight of 4 phases with dialogue transitions approximately 1/4 HP in, halfway, and at the 80% mark. If you're going for the true ending, Sabata notes your reluctance to hit him, which is a really nice touch. He really wants someone to help him. I didn't realize it, but you can actually direct the volley back at his hands. If you have broken them, that hits slightly harder. In the second phase, he may use his hands to swing at you, while the third one has more attacks associated with the hands and faster volleys of elemental attacks. The most frustrating one is the earth one that impairs your vision. I game over it at the final phase because I decided to use the Soul Trance. Its movement speed is a bit too slow and the lock-on was not long enough to dive onto something to be safe from the beam attack. As the fight goes on, you can tell how conflicted Sabata is about the whole thing with his final bits of dialogue and their fight. And the fight ends with it turning an odd color. Is it the end as Otenko notes? Of course not. As Eternals cannot die, Carmilla decides to try to seal it instead, but is ineffective, and Otenko attempts to sacrifice himself again, which is pretty common in the series. So something I didn't mention is the bike minigame, as now your coffin is considered a vector coffin as it can dynamically swap between either. Boktai being Boktai, you can modify its overall frame, weapon, tires, and add modifications to adjust how it performs. I have to say that this edition probably is the most lackluster in comparison to the other sweeping changes they've made overall. While the biking segments are primarily used to travel to a new locale for the first time, and it's additionally its own minigame with unlockable stages and cosmetics from clearing the main side content. And now it's used for the finality of the game. I'll note my criticisms of it and other things afterwards. But here it is, the true end fight. I actually do really like the framing of it, as the point of the fight is a desperate race against the beast, but more so to lure to a spot where the sun is visible. If you believe in the power bonds, friendship and the like, then Carmilla will come back to tell you not to give up, as she can seal the beast with the power of sunlight. If you accidentally touch it, rest in peace, you gotta fight the boss from the beginning if I remember correctly, so I just save stated just to be on the safe side. Anyhow, if you make it to the end with the requirements for the best ending, Otenko comes back from the metaphorical dead to assist you. In the final moments, your bike breaks down from extended use. The framing of the sun's glint just behind the earth is incredibly posited here. The final showdown puts you in soul trance to stop the big ugly. The thing is, it is entirely and easily possible to lose if you don't know the input timing to repeatedly kick, as there's a slight delay on each press, so if you hardly use soul trance as the vampire one is quite overpowered, or if you see the pressure of 10 seconds, well, tough luck. Ask me how I felt when I got a game over here when I initially played this all those years ago and had to restart. I believe that the solar gauge level dictates how much damage you do as well, but I'm unsure, but I wasn't taking chances at this point of the game. The best ending is kinda unsatisfactory in a way, but it's the best possible result in a situation like this. Carmilla somehow frees Sabata of Vanagan and chooses to maintain the seal via internal sleep. She chooses an eternity of sealing the beast of destruction, and she will eventually be fused with the beast, but holds on to the idea of fighting the good fight from what she's witnessed from Sabata and Django's struggles. Most importantly, she loves Sabata too much to let him have this fate and would rather shoulder it herself. The credits roll and there's one final scene. Django and Sabata look out towards the sun at the base of the ancient tree when Trinity makes his appearance, as he somehow survived the trip in the Dark Realm Void. Otenko spouts his musings when Trinity tells him, "What are you talking about?" He lends posterior first and tells him that the legendary warrior did exist. It's him. I don't buy it. Anyhow, he survives as his poncho is specially imbued to protect against dark matter. So this is kind of a theory of mine, but he notes that he wears the pot to protect against his mother's fist. We know that Lita is absurdly strong with her hands, and if such is hereditary and she has a crush on Django, I think that Trinity may actually be a distant descendant of them, just maybe. This also would link up to Lunar Nights, as the protagonist there is also called Django and is a descendant of Trinity in that alternate universe. The poncho also has the colors of Django and Sabata's scarves too. Anyhow, it ends on a comical note and solidifies that Trinity is a gremlin. I love the reiteration of the game's final message. Don't give up, as change adds up day after day. Effort cannot be diminished, as although it may not show, it is something that cannot be taken from you. I think this statement is Sabata's as much as Django's, and the subtext of why the game is called Sabata's Counterattack, as the title doesn't make much sense without this ending. And like many titles, it leads off with an uncertain but hopeful future. I have a small criticism for the bike stuff. Generally, all the previous awards in other games, such as gear, weapons, Gundam soul pieces and whatnot, that are mainly found in the green chest are now generally swapped for these bike parts in these main locations. I don't think that was all too great, as you generally go out of your way to get these rewards, as the bike aspect of the game doesn't have much depth given the small screen size and the maximum of 2 enemies on the screen at once. It's okay, I guess, but it definitely feels like it doesn't really work. I didn't have much reason to seek out new or better parts, as some S-rank requirements for the optional objectives are already annoying enough. It is fun enough though, and I like the music. Another thing that wasn't great was the mini-bosses, as they lacked variety. Most of them are mainly those suits of living armor, and they showed up way too many times, as their only differences are their different elements that simply translates into different weaknesses. However, like the lack of new enemies, I can understand this being a hardware limitation, As this game was released back in 2005, it came out when the Nintendo DS was the hot new thing, and likely would have benefited there. But it also gets the advantage of the developer's experience of creating a late lifecycle GBA title. In any case, the game was mainly smooth sailing, but I did get stuck at some parts which I originally did back in the day, and that was great nostalgia. I was like, oh yeah, I remember being here, and I also remember being stuck here. Some things actually don't really change. I've never really felt the need to grind for levels or money, see Boktai 2 for that, and the optional objectives of eradicating enemies had you covered there if you required it. Anyhow, a great send-off to the series, and while I can ramble on, there are far too many aspects to talk about, such as Crimson enemies, New Game Plus which you keep everything but your levels, or the solar smithing differences in 3. There are better loot drops compared to the other games that include armor, the new gear slots for helmet, arms, and legs, and accessories that are dropped by enemies. New Game Plus boss rush mode, chocolate melting that affects the item below it as a hidden effect, the loan system, and so on. And the crossover. But I'll get to that one in examining Boktai 2 as they are fairly similar, and the one in Boktai 2, which crossovers with Mega Man Battle Network 5, is the far better one in my opinion, as it has a story to tie it together. In any case, I think Boktai 3 aged the best out of the 3 in many ways, though it does kinda lack the unique charm that makes Boktai. Boktai 3 is somehow a great introduction to the game series for a more casual experience, and I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much if you made it to this point of the video. I'd appreciate it if you supported my channel by subscribing and commenting.